Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this talk today. My name is Dr. Mcguire. I'm from the University of Surrey in the UK, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about some research I've done on the developing cybercrime economy. Just as a background to begin with, thinking about some of the backgrounds to cybercrime, because I have done some work on defining cybercrime, thinking about it conceptually. There's three probably major problems we've got in thinking about cybercrime. One is this issue of universalism. Is there a definition of cybercrime that everyone's going to agree to, whether it's legally, conceptually, whatever? There's an issue about how do we link that conceptual structure to particularities of cybercrime, cyber criminals, particular cyber incidents. Or we could go for a position where we think, cybercrime is just about something that we can't really define. So let's be skeptical about it and let's just think about it in terms of what we can do and what we can't do. There's also dilemmas and problems around the relationship between the evidence base and the conceptual frameworks, the big picture of cybercrime and what's happening on the ground. And then finally, there are lots and lots of problems in terms of how much use, how much value is what we as cybercrime researchers think about to law enforcement, to other people who have to deal with cybercrime on a daily basis. What I want to talk to you about is a position that I took in the research that I'm going to talk to you about is this idea of the way that cyber criminals generate revenues. And I think that's a valuable point of departure for reasons which map back onto those three dilemmas I've just mentioned. It enables a kind of a universality. It enables us to map cybercrime activity in general terms across all types of incidents. It allows us then to link those general points to what cyber criminals are actually doing when they generate revenues, what's their rationales, what's their motivations. And it's got some very, very good potential for applied and intervention aspects, for example, by mapping revenue generation and the flows of that and the nodes where revenues cross over. I think it gives some potential tools to law enforcement to intervene. So as I say, this piece of research is based on three reports that I've done recently, which were termed broadly the Web of Profit. The Web of Profit first report, the Cybercrime Economy, looked at how cyber criminals generate revenues, roughly what the value of that is and some of the things they do when they move it around and then how they spend it. Second report built on this by looking specifically at the role of social media platforms within this economy. To what extent do they support or enable cyber criminal activity? And then the third report looked at how, what we think of as the traditional area of cybercrime, which is the darknet, how markets and how revenue generation occurs in that context compared to other contexts like social media platforms. We used a variety of methods here, as you can imagine. Mapping, modeling, researching cybercrime requires a fair bit of ingenuity and invention, as well as standard methodologies because of the difficulty of accessing data there. For example, we used interviews. We looked at, we were very fortunate to gain access to a lot of interviews with convicted cyber criminals, and we were able to talk to them about how they generated the revenues, what they did with it, and how they spent it. We had a team of expert practitioners across law enforcement, policy, the financial sector, government, and we were able to reflect back with them on some of the findings in the interviews. And then we also, over a period of time, built up some relationships with vendors on darknet markets and elsewhere. Around about 30 of them, we were able to conduct interviews with them and to hear back, if you like, from the coalface, what they were doing and some of the techniques they were using. We combined this with observation. So we looked at, in terms of our social media research, about 10 different social media platforms and observed activity there, posts and so on, and about 15 different darknet platforms between the end of 2018 and early 2019. We also conducted in transactions, covert transactions, simulated transactions across these darknet forums, and were able to gather some information about things that we said and did there and where that led during the course of those attempted transactions. And then finally, we analysed a huge mass of data in the course of this research, around about 70,000 plus listings on the darknet, things like commodities that were sold, the types of prices, the way that vendors responded, feedback from purchasers and so on. And then across social media platforms, we looked at a range of different posts, uploads, photos, and so on. So in terms of the broad findings, there was obviously a lot of data that we gathered, and we're still, to be honest, unpicking quite a lot of that. But there's three probably key areas that we might want to think about today. Firstly was the approach of thinking about cybercrime in socio-economic terms. Secondly, the significance of the platform as a structure within this cybercrime economy, as a tool for enabling cybercriminals to conduct what they do and to structure cybercrime activity more widely. And thirdly, I'll talk to you about some of the implications of this research, particularly not just in terms of how cybercrime and how cybercriminals are able to enhance what they do, but also how it relates to the legitimate economy and what law enforcement are able to do in response. So beginning with the first finding, which relates to this idea of a socio-economic approach to cybercrime, I think when we start to look at cybercrime, what we see is a variety of different factors that interplay, whether it's the generation of raw materials, huge different ways in which wealth is generated by cybercriminals, complex interrelationships between the criminals, the producers, the web of operators there, and the consumers, the types of tools they're using, specialized dedicated currencies and exchange commodities of value which cybercriminals are using, and the development of production centers, supply centers, and so on. So while it might be necessary from the empirical level to understand cybercrime in terms of particular cybercrime offenders and offences, we have to ask, is it sufficient? Because does that give us the kind of picture that we really want to gain to be able to understand it in more developed terms? And my argument is that it might be necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need this more interconnected, holistic view of how all those factors fit together in what emerges, as we found in the research, as a cybercrime economy, where cybercrimes are committed, revenues are generated, these revenues are moved around in different ways, either being laundered or spent by cyber criminals, and in many cases are sometimes then reinvested back into cybercrime or indeed into other kinds of crimes. In terms of the scope of this economy and the scale of it, I was certainly very surprised when we started to analyse just how much revenue generation was going on. We valued it at a minimum level of something like about $1.5 trillion in revenues annually. And that's made up by a variety of different inputs, or at least the ones that we were able to measure in some meaningful way. Produce and profits from online markets, the largest slice of that, everything from illicit pharmaceuticals through to dodgy goods from eBay, trade secrets, trading in IP and that kind of thing, about 500 billion, right the way down to things like crimeware and ransomware, which actually I was surprised. I thought that would constitute a much larger slice of the revenue pie, but actually was, of course, 1.6 billion, 1 billion is still pretty substantial, but compared to the other areas of cybercrime revenue generation, it's actually relatively quite small. This is obviously a significant level of revenue generation that cybercriminals are engaged in now, and some significant profits. I mean, as a comparison, it's larger than the combined revenues of the top 3 Fortune 500 companies. It's larger than the GDP of many nation states, including Saudi Arabia. This kind of wealth, this kind of resources generates continually new cyber criminals coming into the field. It allows them to reinvest into crime, sometimes quite serious crimes. It's starting to relate to the legitimate economy, to distort it and to blur with it. And it's also attracting some pretty big players now, particularly nation states. And, I'm just completing a piece of research on how nation states are using cybercrime revenue generation themselves now increasingly. There are a number of issues that we might want to worry about when trying to estimate these kinds of things. It's obviously highly provisional. Like any cybercrime estimate that anyone will give you, you're always going to come up with different ways of estimating that depending on the approach you use. It depends on how you categorize cybercrime. That's obviously a major factor. Some people will only think about cybercrime in terms of the classic cyber-dependent forms of crime, such as malware, distribution, viruses and so on. And they're uneasy about including the profits from illegal markets as cybercrime. We made the decision to do that for lots of reasons we haven't got time to go in here. And of course, it's also, there are problems arising from the kind of sources. Some of these are secondary data sources that you use. How reliable are they, and so on. All of those problems we felt we addressed in certain ways that corrected any particular problems in it as far as we could. And I think what we can say, in spite of those reservations, that the estimate that we arrived at is quite a conservative estimate. For example, there were lots of activities where cyber criminals generate revenues, which we had to admit, because we just weren't certain about how we could measure that. For example, the volume of malware sales, many different frauds, such as romance frauds, which weren't included in the final total. So it's actually below the scale of revenue generation that's actually going on there. We also might think about kind of offline types of revenue generating activities, which might contribute to this cybercrime economy. For example, trafficking in people or other commodities. Where IT plays a role and perhaps facilitates it. There's questions about whether we should include that or not. There are other estimates out there as well, and this 1.5 trillion is actually at the lower end of those estimates. So I think it's a start point, what we did here. As we begin to understand the dynamics of the economy better and better, we're likely to be able to get better estimates. And I think it's beside the point to think that we triangulate to an exact point when we estimate these quantities. If we get in a grey area that's roughly the area, then that itself can be significant, and it tells us a lot, as I think the volume of these revenues do. Second finding I want to kind of talk to you about is the role within this cybercrime economy of the platform. What do I mean by a platform? Well, a platform we can understand as a contemporary mechanism which generates wealth, and it's centered upon sharing, facilitation, and extracting the value from data. Platforms notoriously don't actually make or produce anything themselves, like traditional industries, and steel and shipbuilding and whatever. But many people argue that we have arrived at a stage of capitalism which we can think of as platform capitalism. It's a situation where platforms, whether it's Facebook or eBay or Amazon, are now probably the biggest generators of wealth in the contemporary global economy. And what we found in the research, and I'm writing a book about this at the moment called Platform Criminality, is that cybercrime is developing its own version of the sharing economy. There is a pooling of skills and services via these dedicated platform mechanisms. The platform itself is a way in which money can be generated. For example, we found lots of cases where cybercrime platforms are actually selling advertising space. So the emergence of something we might want to think about as platform criminality, I think, starts to become a plausible hypothesis. It's a type of evolution of cybercrime, and indeed a new kind of criminological reality, which I think is something very, very different from what we've seen in the past, where it's not so much the direct act of crime, which is of interest, but the indirect aspects of crime, the wealth generation that occurs on the back of other crimes via these kind of platform mechanisms. In the research, we found evidence of probably two key ways in which platforms are supporting the cybercrime economy. Firstly, the way that legitimate platforms like the Facebooks, the Twitters, and the Amazons and so on are enabling cybercrime or being used by cybercriminals. And secondly, the development of cybercrime-specific platforms, which to a certain extent model, emulate legitimate platforms in the digital economy. In terms of the first variety here, the use of legitimate platforms, and we look specifically at social media platforms here, as I mentioned earlier on, there's a variety of ways in which these are contributing to cybercrime. Cybercriminals are using them. For example, there's some unique types of revenue generation that are going on these legitimate platforms, such as buying and selling followers, acquiring loyalty points, trust points, and so on. That there's a really healthy and vibrant trade in those kinds of things, which certainly wouldn't have been the case a few years ago. There's a lot of things that are sold on social media platforms. I'm sure many of you are already aware. I mean, drugs, phishing tools, and so on. And actually, when you start to estimate the value of that, it's often far higher than what we think of as the traditional sphere of cybercrime activity, which is the darknet. We find skills being traded, we find criminal recruitment, we find laundering, we find a variety of different activities which social media platforms are generating. And platforms like booking.com, LinkedIn, and so on, there's lots and lots of ways in which they're being used to actually commit frauds as well, which, you know, we haven't got time to go into in detail right now. The third thing then, as well as the development of this cybercrime economy and the socio-economic aspects of cybercrime and the role of the platform in that, is some of the implications that come from the research. I think one of them is the way that cybercriminal capacities are being augmented by these developments. They're targeting things better, they're enhancing their skills, they're sharing them better, and they're also diversifying. They're finding new ways of generating revenue based on some of these first level activities. Secondly, we're seeing, as I've suggested earlier on, an increased blurring between the legitimate and the illegitimate economies. The global digital economy is in many ways becoming skewed and twisted by what's happening in the cybercrime economy. Thirdly, there's the challenges that are being posed to law enforcement and the potential changes in policing which are going to have to come as the result of this really behemoth of revenue generation that we see. So in terms of the refinements in the ways that cybercriminals are able to target and the tools they have, we found, for example, these are a few things we've cherry picked from the data. Around about 4 in 10 of the darknet platforms we looked at were selling particularly targeted services against these Fortune 500 or FTSE 100 companies. So very, very specific tools were being offered to target very specific areas of the economy. And malware, which was related to specific organizations or industries, sort of about 2-to-1 relationship ratio between that and just any old off-the-shelf variety. Of the vendors we spoke to, around about 60% of them said that we can offer you access to 10 or more different business networks if you want it. You could buy a lot of phishing kits off the peg, directed at particular companies for around about $40. There was lots and lots of things that would help you improve your fraud in relation to that company, such as spoof pages and spoof sites. So here's one for the Bank of America that we found. Here was another one for Hewlett-Packard. Here were company invoices we were able to buy for airline companies like Cathay Pacific. You could get receipts very, very easily for companies like Amazon and other sorts of companies. So you're able to target much more effectively. And you were able to target by way of other kinds of data that was we could get hold of, not just the usual stuff of hack data from passwords and so on, much more high level data such as emails, minutes from company meetings, often very sensitive things that were being discussed there, which obviously opened up the option for human factor type attacks based on blackmail or whatever. And obtaining information about company databases was something we found to be quite easy. So, here's a couple of ones we found from the Bank of Qatar, IT company called Sarabel. You could buy the whole database for a relatively reasonable price. Second implication is this idea that the illicit and the licit economies are now beginning to merge in an unholy way and with consequences that we probably don't quite fully understand yet. So one of the things we talked about in the research is this idea of the grey net, where legitimate companies are beginning to exploit the dark net and adapting some of what they do to the way that cybercrime platforms operate, actually stealing, if you like, some of the modus operandi there. So in some ways they do that legally. So you see a lot of corporates now using the dark net to enhance their cybersecurity, to work out what the threats are and then to try and block them by gathering intelligence from the dark net. It's a very, very, secure way of communicating. And there are companies that we spoke to that are beginning to explore the way that they perhaps might buy and sell goods with anonymity for their customers in a way that's, not so dissimilar to, right back to the Silk Road and some of the modern versions of buying and selling through darknet forums. Companies are using the darknet to market their product, but also to recruit skilled IT professionals. So there's a lot of legal ways in which the illicit economy is feeding into the cybercrime economy. But also illicitly, some companies are using it for insider trading. It's quite hard to prove that, but we found a couple of leads which suggest that is going on. Blacklisting of employers they don't like, that there's information being swapped around on the dark net about who companies should employ and who they shouldn't employ, but also consumers as well. You can be very easily blacklisted, as probably most of you know, on Amazon if you complain too often or question some of the purchases you made. And corporate espionage. There are good reason to suspect that the information about rival corporations is being traded on the darknet, either directly by the companies or from cyber criminals who've managed to get hold of that data. There's also ways in which money laundering now, we see banks like HSBC who obviously were hugely exposed as a result of the laundromat scandal. But the way that laundering goes into legitimate banking, back across to Bitcoin, and then is dispersed through the global economy, there's some very, very complex things to try and trace there. And we're starting to do that with looking at some Bitcoin transactions, but there's a lot of work to do. And also I mentioned earlier on some of the research we're doing at the moment into nation states. I think, probably most researchers in cybercrime are aware that countries like North Korea are actively engaging in cybercrime as a way of generating revenues. So, and indirectly, there are countries like Israel, which are making huge profits from cybersecurity and possibly products they sell onto the international market, which are being used in questionable ways. Okay, finally then, third implication is the kind of problems that this is posing for law enforcement and policing. And I'll mention just three ways that we kind of thought about when we looked at some of the findings. We're entering into this kind of what you might be called a whack-a-mole scenario, where law enforcement go in and take down prominent darknet trading platforms, and the names will be familiar to you: Dream Market, Valhalla, Wall Street Market, and so on. And what we see really is, that almost immediately they take those things down, they re-emerge, often better, stronger, more leveraged, with a better understanding of how to avoid future kinds of interventions by law enforcement. And a side effect of these takedowns is, I would argue, there's a degree in which policing credibility is being undermined. These actions are symbolic because it's whack-a-mole, because you take them down and they come back again. The trust that we have in the police to be able to take down these organizations is being eroded. And perhaps there's actually worse. I think, there's a sense in which we're losing something. So, police engage. This is when they took down deep.web, this is what was posted. And you can see almost a kind of, in a sort of a monstrous double of platform criminality, platform policing, you might refer it to as. So they're all very keen to put their logos up and to show how they've all cooperated. It's a symbolic act, and it's more about the presentation and the semblance of cooperation, perhaps, than actually, decisively disrupting these activities. And, the side effect is, in many ways, sometimes counterproductive. So there are great forms of intelligence that you can get off the darknet, and anyone who's sat and looked at it for a while will know that. So, I would, for example, deep.web, which was a really useful source of information. Now that's gone. All of that information has been dispersed into other corners of the darknet and beyond. So one wonders, have we gained or have we lost from that intervention? Worse, what we found is that this kind of activity is being pushed into still more covert forms because of what law enforcement are doing by symbolically taking down these, these more prominent platforms. So a lot of the vendors we spoke to, about 70% of them now, will not conduct any conversations across the darknet about what you're going to buy and sell. That becomes the shop window. You talk to them, then they say, okay, well, if you're interested, come over here to this, this encrypted messaging application, or come across to this private peer-to-peer discussion forum, and so on. It's almost what we call the emergence of an invisible net, a second order of communication where the dark net is really nothing compared to this kind of communication. There are many, many more findings, and hopefully in the question and answer discussion that will follow this recorded lecture, we'll be able to follow those up. But thank you very much for listening for the time being, and I look forward to talking to you shortly.